Welcome to today's Share, our SHMA Talk, which we're joined by a great panel today, and we're talking about a subject which might be slightly controversial. We'll see where we go with it, but our subject is called the myth of the female leader, and I've deliberately put a question mark at the end of that. Is this a myth or is it a real thing? So we'll find out what our panel think shortly. But the reason that I was inspired to talk about this with the group today is I've seen a lot in the press over the last few weeks talking about female leadership, particularly linked to the COVID crisis. And two things really struck me about this. The first one was Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand talking about very strongly that she believes you can be compassionate and empathetic and strong at the same time, and let's not pigeonhole into one or the other. So I found that a really interesting debate, something I agree with wholeheartedly as well. But secondly, lots of stats, and in particular a Guardian article a couple of weeks ago talking about the fact that theoretically female leaders have fared better in terms of their country, both in terms of new cases of COVID and deaths to do with COVID, but also the economy, which might be something that surprised certain people. So it says that female leaders are doing better than their male counterparts when it comes to the response to COVID. So I was quite fascinated by this and thinking, well, is this true or isn't this true? Is there any such thing as a female leader? So I found some friends who have been brave enough to come on board to talk to us about it. And we've deliberately put this group together based on the fact that we have different perspectives and we come from different sectors and we've had different personal experience about all of this. So let me introduce you to our panel. First of all, I have Sarah King, who works, she is a female entrepreneur and she works with hundreds and thousands indeed of other female entrepreneurs. I'll let Sarah explain a little bit more detail about that when she introduces herself. We also have Sanj Shirigunthan, who has had a fantastic experience of working both in the army but also now in the third sector, the charitable sector, and working with some fantastic leaders dealing with some very, very difficult situations around the world, actually. And I'm sure Sanj will explain more of that to you in a second. And Annabelle Berry, who is a good friend of mine, a fellow chief executive, who is working a bit like myself in what is traditionally a very male-dominated sector. So Annabelle works in the cyber infotech sector, but she's also been a female entrepreneur and a business owner and business founder as well. So we've got a nice selection of background here. So let's start by talking to Sarah. So Sarah, what is your view, female leadership or leadership, and why is this subject particularly important in the context of your background?
So if I start there, I've been an entrepreneur for the last 7.5 years. Prior to that, my career spanned the public and the private sector. And I'd always had a fascination with large organisations and how large organisations navigate change and the role that leaders play within that. But 7.5 years ago, I made the leap into entrepreneurship, and 2 years ago co-founded a business where our mission is to support 6,000 women in the UK to start and grow their own businesses. So in terms of the topic of leadership and the impact that gender may have on that, it's a fantastic conversation to be in, so thank you for welcoming me to this panel. So is there such a thing as female leadership? I think that your experience of gender, race, whether you live with a disability or not, your sexual orientation, all of these things influence the people that we are and influence the leaders that we become. There's clear evidence that suggests that actually at a macro level, it is then possible to identify certain capabilities, certain qualities or behaviours that you could assign to those characteristics that you could potentially assign to gender. So at a macro level, I think yes, but I think what's really important is that we identify the individual narratives and recognise that not every, if I speak for myself, cisgendered straight white woman will naturally develop a certain set of talents. That's not necessarily true. So I think we have these two levels of, there's a kind of macro perspective at a research level, but it's really important that we identify those individual narratives.
Interesting, thank you. I'm sure we'll pick up on and delve into some of those topics as we go through this debate. So Sanj, please give us your context in terms of the roles that you've done, but also why is this subject of interest to you?
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me onto the panel. And it's great to be able to talk about this because over the course of my career, I've made some radical sector transitions, beginning first in the British Army and then in the civil society sector. And I think one of the most profound changes I saw, for me certainly, is the move from one kind of leadership that was very much male dominated and masculine in terms of its characteristics, to one which was more dominated by a plethora of different styles of leadership. And the civil society sector overall is more female heavy, although frustratingly not enough at leadership level. And so there's different views and different perspectives, and it's a more inclusive environment that embraces different kinds of leadership, both the military commanding style when you're in an emergency team on the front lines of humanitarian aid and time is pressing, to more affiliative and democratic styles of leadership and more collaborative styles in other settings. So I've learned that from the military, which taught one style of commanding leadership, there are many others, and that the one that the military employs is actually only one. But I've also been fascinated in the last 10 years or so to see how the military I was part of is changing and being more inclusive and embracing different kinds of leadership. Not least women on the front line has meant different views. And I think when we think about, is there a myth to female leadership? I agree with Sarah that everything influences who you are in terms of your identity, your gender, your background, your experiences, and your gender, of course, is one of those. But I prefer the term feminine and masculine leadership styles, because I think, as we'll see when we look at the recent coronavirus response, there are male leaders who've adopted what would be characterized as feminine styles of leadership and have succeeded in that way. But there are others who have maintained a more masculine style, or have ignored aspects one way or the other and have succeeded for other reasons. So I'm really looking forward to unpacking that a little bit and seeing what other aspects of leadership contribute to both the female and male leader differences.
Yeah, thanks, Sanj. And Annabelle, to come to you finally, you're in a male-dominated sector. What's your perspective on this, based on the very senior role you do in a sector where I guess you find yourself as part of quite a small minority?
Yes, I mean, indeed, the sector that I work in, which is cybersecurity and information security, I think the statistics range somewhere between, I think, 17%, and I think it tops off around 20%, I think, of women in the industry as a whole. So I'm very passionate and involved in trying to encourage more women into the industry, and indeed actually to get them in and to get them to stay. We have an awful lot of women who come into the sector that I'm in and then leave quite quickly because of the experiences they have, which is something that I'm trying to get involved in to help identify and stop that from happening. So I was really keen to be involved in the discussion today, because actually this question has been one that I've not been asked until this year. I've only been asked this question about female leadership, and it's only been surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. And I've had lots of people contact me and ask me what my view is of female leadership and why female leaders are faring better. And I was a bit taken aback, actually, to be honest, the first time I was asked, because actually not really sort of occurred to me in terms of a female and male leadership styles. So for me, it's leadership styles. I don't think it's to do with gender at all. So and I think, yes, there are lots of other things that shape who we are as leaders, and I think some permissions perhaps that we're given in terms of our genders as kids, and the way that we're brought up, and all of the things that shape us, as Sarah and Sanj both said, I think lead us to certain styles. But for me, it's definitely leadership styles rather than a question of female or male leadership.
So that leads us really neatly into the situation we have at the moment with the coronavirus. And obviously I referred earlier to the article that was in the Guardian, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, talking about the countries that do well. Now I've been listening to this rhetoric for a while. We've heard about New Zealand, we've heard about Germany, but what surprised me is there seem to be a number of other lists to add to this. Now, of course, of the top 200 countries, I think there's only a handful that are actually being run by women. So it's a very small sample size. And I'm sure statisticians would say it's not empirically perfect. But of course, we've got Finland, we've got Denmark. There's also, I believe, Bangladesh, Taiwan as well as the more famously Germany and New Zealand. how do you perceive the female leaders versus some of their male counterparts during the crisis? The statistics do tend to say that, as I've said, in both health terms, but also economic terms, the female leaders appear to be doing better. But can we really compare Angela Merkel with Jacinda Ardern? Are they really the same people? What do you make of it, Sarah? Set us off.
So again, great question. If you look at the research, so if you look at the work that the World Economic Forum have developed, then if you happen to live in a country with a female head of state, then that is going to be an advantage for you, both in terms of your economy, but the health and well-being of the people who live in that country with you. Are there some shared characteristics and leadership behaviours that those leaders have demonstrated? Yes, absolutely. I think from a media perspective, it has been somewhat easier to focus on those because I think there have been some standout examples of rather poor leadership from male leaders around the world, and everyone likes a headline grabber. I think that what's interesting about these women leaders, and again the research demonstrates this, is that women leaders tend to have a more consultative approach, will tend to have a more diverse set of advisors around them. So have these women made these decisions, these leadership decisions in isolation? No, they will have consulted with their teams, and their teams will have been made up of a diverse group of people. However, ultimately, does that decision and that leadership, that direction that they have taken their countries in, sit with them ultimately? Then yes, of course. So I think we are able to look at those leaders and pull out some key traits that they have all demonstrated. But I think fundamentally what's important about that is that it will be grounded in an approach of empathy. So engaging with the people in their countries to understand what the needs are, and then consulting with their leadership teams to help them to make decisions.
So thanks, Sarah. Annabelle, if I come to you now, I quoted Jacinda Ardern again earlier, talking about empathy, which Sarah's picked up on, and being strong. Do you think that has helped the female leaders in your analysis of what's going on at the moment, or do you think there's something else at play there?
I think it definitely would have helped, but for me, I think it's to do with degrees of emotional intelligence rather than anything else. And the thing that bothers me about the narrative around the female leadership and only picking out certain qualities, which is the care, the empathy, the sympathy, the compassion, is that it's a narrative that we're very comfortable in pinning on women. And actually there are lots of other qualities that these women have to be successful leaders. You can't just be one, you just can't have those qualities. And I think the reason I think it bothers me so much is because then that would kind of imply that there's then a male type of leadership, which is to do with, the opposite end of the scale, which is more assertive and more direct and perhaps stronger. And at some point, the situation that we're in with regards to the pandemic will change, and, the economic pressures that we're seeing worldwide come in. And then are we going to then flip back to, well, actually what we need now is, stronger male type leadership, because actually the nice, warm, fluffy stuff that's been talked about in the press is no longer required. And so, yes, absolutely, those women will have elements of that. And I think, again, it's more to do with transformational leadership as opposed to transactional leadership for me, and higher degrees of emotional intelligence rather than anything else. But so I don't have an issue with actually singing about those qualities and actually promoting those qualities, but doing that in isolation, I think, is where we need to be very careful.
Yeah, thank you. And Sanj, what's your perspective looking at this globally? And obviously you've seen some of these countries firsthand as well, in a way that perhaps we might not have experienced it.
Yeah, I think the point you made at the start, Sarah, is quite true, that we've got a very small sample size, but we've also got these alarming contrasts of a number of worst performing countries led by alpha type male leaders who are to a degree in denial. There's also, I think, research that's been done to show that politics generally around the world advantages men, which means lower quality male leaders rise up and higher quality female leaders, because they need to be higher quality because of biases, rise up. So we're seeing the best of women in leadership roles because of these biases, and arguably a much lower quality pool amongst men. But I think when we look at coronavirus, it's complex. There's a stronger correlation than just female leaders, which is especially amongst OECD countries that have had in the past female leadership, even if they don't currently, have performed better than countries that have not, which suggests that societies that are more inclusive, whether they currently have a male or female leader, are doing better because of what comes inherently in a more inclusive society. So if you look at South Korea, which is doing extraordinarily well in terms of the response, they don't have a male, they have a male leader at the moment, but because they have been more inclusive in the past, they may be doing better. Having said that, you know, the research has also shown that a high number of South Koreans, both male and female, think male South Koreans, you know, there is a problem in terms of how they behave in society as well. Similarly, there are male leaders who've done well. Trudeau, for example, and one could argue that's because he has adopted feminist principles, a more inclusive cabinet. He's strived for gender equality both in his government and in society. And so going to Annabelle's point, I don't think it's as simple as saying women have these leadership traits that have suited. I think others have adopted them, but also we see women who've adopted stronger leadership styles. So one couldn't say that Merkel has succeeded through empathy as much as very honest, open, direct communications, not sugarcoating it, and being quite blunt about the truth, but also trusting the science because she is a scientist. So I agree with Annabelle. I don't think it's as simple as saying female leaders versus male leaders. I think we need to unpick it in the course of our discussions.
Some research that I've always been interested in, and I know some of you have seen this, is some research that was done in 2013 and a book subsequently written, obviously, called the Athena Doctrine. And that very briefly interviewed 64,000 people in 13 different countries, asked what they felt a modern leader needed, what characteristics they needed, what skills or characteristics a leader would be successful in the future, looking at the direction that the world was traveling at that point. Obviously that's 7 years old now. And then they asked a separate sample of people to group them into feminine and masculine characteristics. So it's interesting that you pick up on those words, Sanj. I do wonder if it's more about feminine and masculine, not actually gender, and that's not obviously the same thing, and it's more about style. And you could argue that, you know, that Justin in Canada, you know, has some of those attributes. But what do you think, thinking about the world at the moment and what's going to be needed post-COVID, what do you think are those attributes? Let's forget about gender for a second, because I know it's something we all want to drop, talking about putting us into two different boxes here. What do you think are the key attributes that leaders will need going forwards to be successful in a post-COVID world? So if I come to, I'll come straight back to Sanj, actually. Let's shake this up a bit.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because if we're talking about post-crisis, is it back to business as usual? Is it about bluff and bluster? And I think politics in many countries has fundamentally changed, and the way you communicate to your electorate hopefully has shifted. And I think a more inclusive, honest, open style is starting to come through. Those who say it'll be over by Christmas are going to find themselves found out. And I think hopefully that leads to lasting change, both in male and female leaders. I think the biggest challenge will be how do we embrace a more inclusive approach to politics and in our leaders? And that's a difficult one, because there's a tendency to box female leaders as being good at one thing and male leaders at another. And it's easy to readopt those stereotypes. And I think, as you say, masculine and feminine characteristics are better, because I don't believe any leader should allow themselves to be boxed into one set of traits. And there are many different leadership styles. And there's an opportunity here for male leaders to really learn from the best of what female leaders are predominantly showing, though not exclusively. And similarly, female leaders shouldn't allow themselves to be seen simply as empathetic or collaborative or the nurturing leader, but also based on their experience and performance in coronavirus as decisive, taking early steps. And if we look at Ardern and Merkel, one of the greatest successes and what they're benefiting from is an early decision to go into lockdown, which could have backfired massively. So it was decisive leadership that benefited them. So I think those leaders hopefully have learned also that having adopted more flexible styles, they can inherit and hold on to them to be better leaders post-COVID. So if we see a merging and a blending of these skills rather than boxing leaders into one or the other, we're going to have a better set of leaders. We've also got a bunch who I think are going to be highly resistant to change, and perhaps that's the nub of it, is female leaders may be more introspective and therefore more open to adapting, whereas some of the alpha male leaders, who I don't need to mention, are more resistant to any sort of change and will carry on as usual.
Yeah, I can see that. Sarah, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree with you in terms of it's a style of leadership that needs both empathy and consultation with data-driven, decisive action. And I think that's what we've seen from those leaders in those countries. Can those qualities, do we see those qualities in people with different stories, different backgrounds, different genders? Because of course it's not just male and female. Absolutely. I think what's really important, and I guess picking up on your point, Sanj, that we have seen a very strong dominant narrative for a very long time. And I think what's important here is that we become okay with, that we celebrate and amplify those different narratives and those different stories. So who are the people who are demonstrating those leadership qualities, and let's tell their stories. Let's understand their background, their gender, their ethnicity, whether they live with disability, and let's allow those stories to come to the fore, because it's those stories that will act as really effective role models for future generations of leaders as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Annabelle, the characteristics then that you think are going to be increasingly important?
I think moving forward, I think it's about removing stereotypes and biases for all genders, really. I mean, I think, you know, the historically or actually still going on, I think, you know, it's not been acceptable for men to show the caring, compassionate side. You know, that's viewed as a weakness quite often. So I think in some ways what's happened this year has been women are more comfortable to show that, because it's always been allowed, you know, it's always been encouraged for us to show that part of ourselves. And so it's easier for us to be able to do that. Whereas, you know, I think quite often from childhood, men are told, you know, not to be emotional, not to show that side, because it's seen as a weakness, I think, in terms of leadership sometimes. So I think it's giving permission for people to remove some of the stereotypes and the biases to actually, because I know a lot of male leaders who've done phenomenally well in the last 6 months. Similarly, I know a lot of female leaders who haven't, and have approached things in a way that hasn't been the best way of going about things, because they are still very much in a transactional leadership model. So I think certain elements will be important moving forward, because I think leadership is changing. I think that, you know, within businesses certainly, and I think there is a direct link in between greater diversity and inclusivity within businesses and how well those businesses do. I mean, 15 to 25%, you know, they tend to do much better. So this is a business issue as well as a diversity and inclusion issue. And why wouldn't you, as a leader, want to embrace that? And I think similarly, I think looking at the emotional side of leadership and embracing that also leads to greater creativity and productivity. So again, you know, why wouldn't we want to embrace that as leaders? Anything that is going to get our people and our workforces to be more creative, to be more productive, to want to pull together, I think is a fantastic fantastic thing for us to be looking at as business leaders. So it's, for me, within business, I suppose it's a real core discussion that we need to be looking at. And I think it's to do with permissions, really, and removing barriers across all genders.
I love that you've said that, Annabelle. For me, it is a commercial debate. The latest McKinsey research, which I think is probably what you were just referencing, you know, this is not just a nice thing to do or a moral thing to do to embrace inclusivity. It's actually a commercial thing to do. And I think, you know, whichever doctrine you buy into there, buy into one, because this is better for business, better for the economy, better for society, better for the world. So, you know, it's time now, I think, to believe the stats, because there is enough evidence flying around. So if I can come to you, you clearly talk to an awful lot of female leaders, albeit a lot of them founders, entrepreneurs, people setting up their own businesses, slightly different style of leadership. What do you think is either the benefit and or the danger of some of the rhetoric we're getting into now, as far as the confidence and really supporting the women that you work with? How would they view some of this?
So I think the danger with any label is that it polarizes people, and it suggests that people are born in a particular way, and actually we know that people are able to grow, to learn, to develop, and of course the world we live in, our circumstances influence the people we become, the leaders that we become. I think sadly though, the use of labels around the world have been used as a way to kind of put people into boxes and define them and suggest that that is what they are, when in reality we know that diversity is about saying, well, I can be this and I can be that as well. I can be empathetic and I can be decisive, and those two things complement each other. I think the benefit of the conversation around, do all of these things, do gender, does an ethnicity influence who you are as a leader? I think they're really important conversations, because as I've said, the reality is we live in a world that has been heavily skewed by a dominant narrative, and a narrative that is white, male, straight. And that has shaped the world that we have lived in. And to create the type of change that we're talking about, where we're saying, let's celebrate a different style of leadership, let's celebrate all of the people who embrace that style of leadership, we're going to have to highlight and amplify some of those narratives that haven't had the dominant platform and the spaces to be able to share their story.
Do you feel this is what's holding women back? I mean, I know from conversations with you, some of the stats that, you know, the entrepreneurial world is very stacked currently still in, the numbers are supporting male entrepreneurs rather than female entrepreneurs. What is it that's holding female entrepreneurs, female leaders back in that sector?
So I think it's about, there are ecosystem challenges. So you only have to look at the world of investment to see that only 4% of funding in the UK goes to female founded businesses. Less than 1% of funding in the UK goes to entrepreneurs who are people of colour. Like, there's a significant systemic inequality there. In terms then of, you know, programs of support for entrepreneurs, the most effective programs of support start with an understanding of need. And the reality is that research, that understanding of need, has focused on a dominant narrative. And so I think for women entrepreneurs, for people who don't fit that dominant narrative, we need to put our hand up and say, this is my need, this is what I need this ecosystem to develop towards. And then we need leaders within those ecosystems who can put their hand up and say, you know what, for us to live in a more diverse and inclusive world, we need to create change.
Thank you. Sanj, if I may bring you into this, obviously you have a slightly different perspective to the rest of us, because you see this from the male perspective, but what is the danger and or indeed the benefits to male leaders, do you think, of this kind of increased rhetoric that we have at the moment about gender and leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I would take us back to probably one of the most important words when you talk about a successful leader, which is trust. And you can engender trust through a number of different styles. I think what we're seeing, though, is that the style that's predominantly used to characterize male leaders isn't enough in itself to build trust, especially in this crisis. And where female leaders have succeeded, it's because through the traits that they've exhibited, they've built trust. And what I would say is, let's not oversimplify and say that's the only path. I'll give a very quick example. Peru is one of the top countries for COVID deaths. I think it's creeping into the top 5 in the world, believe it or not. It's not getting much coverage. But its president, Vizcarra, is currently sitting on around 64-65% approval rating, down from, albeit a high of around 87%. And why? Because actually he's still benefiting from addressing corruption that was endemic in the country through some real meaningful change that he took about 6 months ago, before the crisis started, actually. And people trust him to take the right steps, even though he's done everything he can, lockdown and all of that, and the country is still suffering enormously. So I think it isn't so much only female leaders can build that trust. I think there is a role for male leaders, but they're more likely to succeed if they adopt different styles and also take on lessons in terms of more open communication, more collaborative, more affiliative. So some of the column of things that we see in feminine leadership styles and traits. And certainly that's been my experience and what I've benefited for, coming from a very male dominated sector to something more balanced.
And do you think there are any downsides of this? You know, are certain individuals going to feel threatened potentially by some of the dialogue that's emerging at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think male leaders will see cynically that this is a way to promote perhaps positive discrimination, to have more female leaders, and therefore it's displacing their traditional dominance in any sector. And I think that's where we need to push back. And I think that's where both existing male and female leaders need to speak up and talk about this as not a threat to anyone, but about making us all better leaders by learning from more female leaders who are pioneering other approaches, more inclusive approaches to leadership. But again, the worst thing we can do is box this into, you have to be a female to have these kind of leadership styles, or a male. So then you have boards hiring male or female leaders because they think, if I want this, I need to hire a female. If I want this, I need to hire a male, which is just the wrong.
And we touched on this a little bit earlier, and I know some of us are familiar with Daniel Goleman's work about situational leadership and the 6 different styles of leadership. Of course, just hiring somebody doesn't mean that's the only style they can do. They can flex their style depending on the situation. And, you know, some of you mentioned this earlier about developing different skills and then being able to use them based on what is needed at that point. And I think that is also, for me, a key part of this. Annabelle, benefits and dangers of the current dialogue as you see it?
Well, I think the perception and the demands of leaders is changing. You know, it is changing. And I think leaders have got to either change and adopt with it. Otherwise, I think that very soon, I think people are going to either vote with their feet within organizations or you know, or otherwise. So I think the demands are changing, and I think the authoritative hierarchical leadership that's existed for you know, decades is going away, and people are going to be looking at leaders who are, completely agree with Sanchez, you know, need to earn trust, need to earn confidence, and understand how to do that. I think that's really at the heart of this. So I think this isn't just something that leaders need to look at. I think the demands of people and looking at leadership is changing, and we've got to change with that, or you know, you won't last very long, I think, moving forward, which is only, so I think there will be a greater force of change around this. And I think it's around just breaking down, you know, our you know, we sort of tend to judge, you know, we judge by our own linguistic norms. You know, what does confidence look like? What does capability look like? You know, we have very fixed views in, you know, within our own as individuals about what that looks like. And I think we need to be able to challenge that, because what a confident person or a capable person to one person, you know, they may have that, you know, they may have that, that capability, but they're not able to demonstrate that or communicate that in a way that we're used to, perhaps. And I think it's just being able to be aware of that. So I think it's just greater understanding and education, really, about how to spot that. Otherwise, we may well be losing talent that we could be hiring within our businesses just because they don't look like a successful person that we got in our minds. So I think it's really important to challenge that.
So we need to wrap this up in a second. I've actually got one more question for you before I ask you to wrap up, and it's inspired by something that you've just said, Annabelle. Can any of us imagine that we will still need situations where there is a command and control? Because we're talking here potentially that we're moving away from the command and control, but are we throwing it away entirely, or do you see situations where that might still be applicable? Sarah, what do you think?
I think it's about, as we've talked about, this ability to be adaptive based on the context. I think if there's one thing the last 6 months have taught us is we never really know what's around the corner. So actually, is it going to be required as a leadership style in certain circumstances? Yes, I'm sure it will be. Will we see it diminish in the number of contexts where it gets used? Yes, I also think that that's likely.
Sanj, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, in my profession, you absolutely need command and control in some situations. So we send teams out to some extraordinarily precarious situations, male and female leaders. In fact, we're female heavy at the moment in terms of team leaders. And they need to make decisions on the spot. They can't wait for direction. They can't take a vote. They've got to make the call and they've got to live with it. And we train the teams for that. We can't hire people who are the finished product. We do assessments when we hire people, and we do ongoing training out in Cornwall countryside in stressful situations. And we hire people for what they are good at, and we teach and adapt them to learn the other styles of leadership that they need, including command and control. So it isn't that we hire people with command and control, because you're likely to get one particular sort if you do that. We lay that onto them on top of their existing skills. And let's remember, at the heart of this is, I think something Maya Angelou said, you don't remember what leaders say, you remember how they make you feel. And I think that's really important when you think about even command and control. It's not about shouting at people. It is about being decisive, about already having that trust. And at the end of it, people feeling like you know what you're doing and that you're making decisive decisions. And I don't think that's either male or female. I think it's a skill leaders can learn.
Thank you. So Annabelle, I'm going to turn to you just to kind of give us your final thoughts on this, really. Having started half an hour ago with one position, what's your final thoughts now about the myth of the female leader? You know, is it a myth? Do we have female leadership? And what would you like to see happen going forwards? If you could just summarize that.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are is that there isn't a female and a male leader. I think we are leaders that have different qualities, I think, as we've discussed. And I think it's knowing when to push forward and to pull back on in certain areas. And I completely agree with what Sandra's just said about the old-fashioned command and control. I think will go, but I don't think it will go completely. And it's just about being more consultative and tapped into people's needs. So I don't think there isn't a male and a female type leader for me. It's good leaders and perhaps not so good leaders, I think.
Final words, Sarah?
I think there are shared characteristics, and I think, as I've said, gender, race, ethnicity, all of these things influence the leaders that we become. And I think it's really, really important that we celebrate those diverse narratives, that we don't box people, and that we recognise that people are able to learn and develop and adopt different styles based on the position they find themselves in.
Thank you. Sanj?
I mean, I would conclude with the thought that I've held with two former bosses I've had, both females and both very different. One taught me always communicate, don't let silos build. And she was amazing at making sure everyone knew what everyone else was doing. And she always used to say, you're all doing a marvelous job. And she said it in a way that you believed it every time she said it. And I'm not sure I've quite practiced the art of doing it as well as she ever did. And the other female leader taught me, speak up, and demand what your team needs, even if it's unpopular, which often is attributed to males to be the loud one in the room. And you know, these both different styles from both female leaders I've held, and that proves, I think, the point that there isn't such a thing as a female leader. Females can be any kind of leader they want, and males, as we've seen, have succeeded with adapting their traditional notion of leadership into a broader definition, which includes some of the traits that more female leaders have. So if we can just drop the term male, female and just talk about leaders, but talk about traits which may be more masculine or feminine historically, but are actually becoming more blurred, I think we're going to have a great crop of future leaders.
Thank you. And for me, I think you've ended on a note there that brings something else into it. You've referenced choice. And I think we do have a choice about the kind of leader that we are and the kind of leader we want to be and the kind of leader we are in any particular moment or any particular situation. I'm hearing increasing dialogue from chief execs talking about their to-be list as much as their to-do list. So making a decision each day who they want to be, and I guess we always have that choice. So thank you, that's a brilliant note to end on. For those of you who've been watching, we haven't had time to deal with questions. If you have put questions into the chat, if you want to email through questions afterwards, we are committed to getting back to you if you've got any thoughts or questions that you want to feed through. We would love to keep a debate going about this as well, and love to hear what all of you think. So you know, please do let us know what you think about this, and if you're watching this again on LinkedIn or something like that, again, please do keep the debate going. So one final thing I'll say, and Sanj hasn't asked me to do this, but I had a quick look at his website earlier today. You have a live appeal going at the moment, don't you, in shelterbox.org for the COVID crisis? Incredibly worthwhile. So if anybody does want to go and have a look at that, the work you're doing to try and provide shelter for people, particularly in times like this when they have added threats added to what they're doing as well, it seems incredibly worthwhile. So I would encourage people to have a look at the shelterbox.org website and see if there's anything you can do to help out with that as well.
Thank you, Sarah.
So thanks again, everybody. And it's been great to catch up with all of you. And I'm sure this debate will continue.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.